War narratives are rarely neutral accounts of reality. They are constructed, amplified, and circulated within systems of power that benefit from fear, urgency, and public emotional reaction. When headlines announce escalating conflicts, weapons transfers, or looming global confrontations, they often serve interests beyond simple information sharing. Media corporations gain attention and advertising revenue through sensational framing. Political leaders gain justification for expanding military budgets, and defense contractors gain access to massive public funding streams. In this ecosystem, conflict becomes not only a geopolitical event, but also an economic opportunity. The arms industry is one of the most powerful beneficiaries of war driven narratives. When the public is convinced that threats are growing and enemies are multiplying, calls for increased defense spending become politically easy. Legislators approve contracts worth billions, often with minimal public scrutiny, under the banner of national security. These contracts generate profits for weapons manufacturers, shareholders, and private military suppliers, creating a financial incentive to maintain a permanent state of perceived danger. Over time, this produces what many analysts describe as a war economy, where peace becomes economically inconvenient for those who profit from militarization. Political elites also benefit from these narratives. External threats can be used to distract from domestic economic inequality, social unrest, or policy failures. When citizens are encouraged to focus on foreign enemies, they are less likely to question internal systems of power, wealth concentration, or declining public services. War rhetoric becomes a tool of control, shaping public opinion and narrowing the range of acceptable debate. Instead of asking whether conflict is necessary, people are pushed to ask only how aggressively it should be pursued. Media framing plays a central role in sustaining this cycle. Complex international disputes are often reduced to simplified good versus evil stories that remove historical context and economic motivations. This simplification makes it easier to justify aggressive policies while discouraging deeper analysis. When viewers are repeatedly exposed to emotionally charged images, dramatic language, and urgent breaking news formats, critical thinking is replaced by reactive judgment. The result is a public atmosphere where escalation feels normal and restraint feels dangerous. At the global level, war narratives also shape alliances and economic competition. Countries use the language of security to expand influence, protect trade routes, control energy supplies, and assert dominance over strategic regions. Sanctions, military aid, and diplomatic pressure are framed as moral necessities even when they serve commercial or geopolitical goals. In this sense, war narratives function as marketing campaigns for power, selling confrontation as stability and militarization as protection. The most troubling aspect is that this system normalizes endless conflict. When war becomes profitable and politically useful, there is little incentive to pursue genuine peace. Negotiations appear weak, compromise looks risky, and diplomacy is portrayed as delay rather than solution. This creates a self reinforcing cycle in which each crisis justifies the next buildup, each confrontation funds the next weapons program, and each media headline prepares the public for the next escalation, turning fear into a renewable resource that fuels political authority, corporate profit, and strategic dominance while shaping public perception in ways that make alternative paths harder to imagine and more difficult to pursue in real world decision making processes that continue expanding budgets, increasing military presence, strengthening surveillance systems, tightening alliances, and reinforcing structures that depend on perpetual tension rather than collective security and shared stability across borders and societies and global communities struggling to break free from systems that reward conflict over cooperation. China, Iran relations must be understood not as an isolated diplomatic development, but as part of a much broader transformation in the global balance of power. For decades, the international system has been shaped by a dominant Western led economic and political framework with the United States at its center. Trade rules, financial institutions, sanctions mechanisms, and military alliances have largely reflected this structure. When China deepens its ties with countries that are heavily sanctioned or politically isolated by the West, it signals a strategic challenge to that long-standing order. China's rise as an economic superpower has been driven primarily through trade, infrastructure investment, and industrial expansion rather than direct military confrontation. Projects linking Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe have strengthened Beijing's global footprint and reduced dependence on Western controlled trade routes and financial systems. By strengthening partnerships with countries such as Iran, China is not merely pursuing bilateral cooperation, but actively diversifying its energy supplies, securing alternative transit corridors, and building a network of economic relationships that operate outside traditional Western influence. Iran occupies a particularly important position in this strategy. It sits at the crossroads of major energy routes and regional trade corridors, holds vast oil and gas reserves, and maintains strategic access to key waterways. For China, cooperation with Iran provides long term energy security and regional leverage. For Iran, partnership with China offers economic survival amid sanctions, access to investment, and an alternative market for its exports. This mutual dependency reflects a shared interest in weakening the effectiveness of unilateral economic pressure imposed by dominant powers. At the geopolitical level, these partnerships also reflect resistance to the use of sanctions as tools of global control. Many countries increasingly view sanctions not as neutral instruments of diplomacy, but as economic weapons that can destabilize economies, restrict development, and impose political compliance. China's willingness to engage with sanctioned states sends a message that alternative systems of trade and finance are emerging. New payment mechanisms, currency agreements, and regional trade blocs reduce reliance on traditional financial centers and challenge the monopoly of existing economic institutions. This shift creates anxiety among established powers. When economic dominance is threatened, military narratives often intensify. Strategic competition becomes framed as security risk rather than economic rivalry. Allegations of weapons transfers, military alliances, and covert cooperation become part of a broader struggle over influence. The focus moves away from trade imbalances, technological competition, and industrial policy and towards security based rhetoric that justifies containment strategies and expanded military presence. What makes this moment particularly significant is that it reflects a transition toward a multipolar world. Power is no longer concentrated in a single center, but is increasingly distributed among competing regional and global actors. As new alliances form, old power structures weaken. This transition is not smooth or peaceful by default. It is marked by friction, uncertainty, and competing visions of global leadership. The relationship between China and Iran represents one example of how emerging powers and sanctioned states are recalibrating their positions within this evolving system. reshaping economic flows, political alignments, and strategic priorities in ways that signal long term structural change across international relations, trade architecture, energy markets, diplomatic leverage, regional stability, global influence networks, and the future direction of geopolitical competition between established dominance and rising alternative power centers. Iran's position in global politics reveals how regional nations are often transformed into strategic instruments within much larger power struggles. Rather than being treated as independent actors with their own economic and social priorities, such countries frequently become leverage points in contests between superpowers. In this dynamic, Iran is not only a state pursuing national security and economic survival, but also a bargaining chip used by global powers to test influence, project strength, and negotiate dominance across entire regions. For decades, Iran has faced economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and recurring military threats. These pressures have pushed Tehran to search for external partnerships that can provide economic stability and political backing. When powerful nations engage with Iran, it is rarely driven by humanitarian concern or mutual development alone. Instead, Iran becomes valuable because of its geographic location, energy resources, and symbolic resistance to Western dominance. This turns the country into a strategic asset rather than a fully respected partner, reducing complex domestic realities into geopolitical utility. From the perspective of global powers, Iran represents leverage in negotiations with rivals. Supporting Iran can signal defiance toward adversaries, disrupt existing alliances, and create pressure points in the Middle East. At the same time, opposing Iran can be used to strengthen regional partnerships, justify military presence, and reinforce security alliances. In both cases, Iran becomes a tool within a larger strategic calculation where decisions are often made far from Iranian cities and communities, inside conference rooms where global influence matters more than local consequences. This chessboard approach to international politics carries serious risks. When nations are treated as pieces rather than people, escalation becomes easier. Military aid, economic sanctions, and political pressure are deployed with little regard for long term stability. Each move is designed to gain advantage, but the cumulative effect is growing regional tension, weakened economies, and rising insecurity for civilians. The strategic logic prioritizes dominance over diplomacy, creating cycles of retaliation rather than pathways to resolution. Iran's internal challenges further complicate this reality. Economic hardship caused by sanctions affects everyday life, limiting access to goods, raising inflation, and reducing employment opportunities. These pressures are not abstract policy outcomes, they shape daily survival. Yet in global discourse, these human consequences are often ignored in favor of strategic narratives about deterrence, containment, and influence. The people become invisible while the state becomes symbolic, reinforcing the idea that geopolitical competition is detached from human cost. At the regional level, Iran's role also influences neighboring countries. Tensions involving Iran affect energy markets, shipping routes, and political stability across the Middle East. Rival states respond with their own alliances and military preparations, further expanding the web of confrontation. This regional ripple effect demonstrates how a single nation's position on the global chessboard can impact millions of lives beyond its borders, turning localized tensions into international crises. The transformation of Iran into a geopolitical bargaining chip ultimately reflects a broader pattern in international relations where power politics overrides cooperative problem solving and strategic advantage is valued more than mutual security, long term development, regional peace, economic integration, diplomatic trust, humanitarian stability, social resilience, institutional reform, sustainable growth, and the collective future of societies caught between competing global ambitions and rival power blocs operating through influence, pressure, negotiation tactics, military signaling, economic leverage, information campaigns, and political maneuvering across interconnected regions and global systems without genuine concern for lasting stability. When geopolitical tensions escalate, the immediate focus is often placed on military strategies, diplomatic statements, and shifting alliances, yet the real consequences unfold quietly in the lives of ordinary people. Civilians rarely participate in the decisions that lead to confrontation, but they absorb the economic and social shocks that follow. Rising fuel prices, disrupted supply chains, and inflation become everyday realities as conflict narratives push markets into uncertainty and speculation. What begins as a political dispute quickly transforms into a household crisis. Economic instability is one of the earliest and most damaging effects. When tensions rise, currencies weaken, investment slows, and trade routes become unpredictable. Businesses hesitate to expand, factories reduce production, and job opportunities shrink. Families face higher costs for basic necessities such as food, transportation, and energy. These pressures are not temporary inconveniences. They reshape living standards and push vulnerable communities closer to poverty. The economic burden spreads across borders, affecting not only the countries directly involved, but also global consumers connected through international markets. Social systems also suffer under the weight of prolonged instability. Governments facing security threats often divert public funds away from education, healthcare, and social programs toward military spending. Hospitals become underfunded, schools face shortages, and infrastructure projects are delayed. The long term development of societies is sacrificed in favor of short term security priorities. Young people grow up in environments shaped by uncertainty, limited opportunity, and reduced public investment, creating generational consequences that extend far beyond the immediate crisis. Psychological stress is another hidden cost. Constant exposure to conflict news, political tension, and economic anxiety creates widespread fear and uncertainty. Families worry about the future, workers fear job loss, and communities experience growing distrust and division. The emotional impact of living under prolonged geopolitical tension often goes unmeasured, yet it deeply affects mental health, social cohesion, and public morale. This invisible damage accumulates slowly but persistently, weakening societies from within. At the international level, humanitarian conditions deteriorate as resources are redirected toward confrontation. Aid programs face funding cuts, refugee support becomes politicized, and international cooperation weakens. Populations caught in conflict zones or under economic pressure struggle to access basic services, while global attention shifts toward strategic competition rather than human relief. The prioritization of power over people reshapes global priorities and reduces empathy across borders. Perhaps most unjust is the imbalance of sacrifice. Political leaders, corporate executives, and defense contractors operate far from the consequences of instability. While they negotiate deals and sign contracts, ordinary citizens manage rising costs, reduced services, and declining economic security. This separation between decision makers and those affected creates a system where accountability is limited and suffering is normalized. The repeated pattern of civilian hardship reveals a structural problem in how global conflicts are managed. Instead of prioritizing economic stability, social welfare, and cooperative problem solving, international strategies often focus on dominance, deterrence, and competition. This approach guarantees that the burden of global tension will continue to fall on those with the least power to influence outcomes, reinforcing inequality, widening economic gaps, deepening social divisions, increasing vulnerability among marginalized populations, destabilizing labor markets, disrupting education systems, weakening healthcare access, straining public resources, reducing long term development opportunities, and embedding cycles of hardship that persist long after headlines fade and political attention shifts elsewhere. The global system is undergoing a historic transformation as power gradually shifts away from a single dominant center toward a more fragmented and competitive structure. For much of the modern era, international politics was shaped by clear hierarchies of influence, with a small group of powerful nations setting the rules for trade, finance, security alliances, and diplomatic norms. Today, that structure is weakening. Emerging economies, regional powers, and alternative alliances are challenging established authority and reshaping the global balance in ways that create both opportunity and instability. This transition toward a multipolar world brings new complexities. Instead of one dominant framework guiding international cooperation, multiple power centers now pursue their own interests, priorities, and strategic visions. This leads to overlapping alliances, competing economic blocs, and parallel financial systems. While diversity of power can reduce dependence on a single authority, it also increases competition and uncertainty. Nations must navigate a landscape where rules are less uniform and global coordination becomes more difficult. Economic rivalry plays a central role in this shift. Competition over technology, energy resources, manufacturing dominance, and digital infrastructure has intensified. Countries are investing heavily in domestic industries while attempting to secure foreign markets and supply chains. Trade disputes, sanctions, and strategic resource control have become common tools in this new era. Economic policy is no longer just about growth. It is increasingly tied to national security and geopolitical positioning. Security dynamics are also changing. As global power becomes more distributed, military alliances evolve, and regional security arrangements gain importance. Nations strengthen defense partnerships not only to deter direct threats, but also to signal influence and protect strategic interests. This creates overlapping spheres of influence that sometimes compete rather than cooperate. The result is a more complex security environment where miscalculations and misunderstandings carry higher risks. Diplomatic relationships are similarly affected. Countries seek flexibility by maintaining multiple partnerships rather than relying on a single dominant ally. This strategic balancing allows states to maximize benefits from different relationships, but also increases diplomatic tension. Negotiations become more transactional, driven by short term gains rather than long term cooperation. Trust becomes harder to sustain as global politics shifts toward competition based engagement. The cultural and ideological impact of this transition should not be overlooked. Different governance models, economic systems, and political values compete for influence on the global stage. Nations promote their own development paths as alternatives to traditional Western frameworks. This ideological diversity reshapes international discourse and challenges long standing assumptions about leadership, progress, and global norms. For ordinary people, this evolving global order affects daily life in subtle but significant ways. Economic volatility, shifting job markets, changing trade relationships, and fluctuating currencies all reflect broader geopolitical competition. The instability of the global system influences prices, employment opportunities, and long term economic planning for households and businesses alike. The movement toward a competitive multipolar world ultimately represents both a challenge and a test for the international community. Without strong mechanisms for cooperation and conflict resolution, rivalry can escalate into prolonged tension and repeated crises. The direction this transition takes will depend on whether global actors prioritize shared stability or continue to pursue influence through competition, power projection, strategic dominance, economic leverage, alliance building, technological control, resource management, diplomatic maneuvering, political signaling, and regional influence expansion across an increasingly interconnected but divided world system shaped by shifting priorities and evolving centers of authority.